For quite some time, I wasn't able to make myself to do this video. The thing is, I knew that the results of the conference were quite controversial and sometimes even ugly, honestly. I felt like I'm not ready to dive into all the colorful details of what exactly happened. But all in all, I decided to make this video and to make it quite comprehensive so you guys would get like the well-rounded picture, all the positive results and negative results, because it's certainly not just black or white. COP26 was indeed an important summit. Back in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed and the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius was born, countries decided that each one of them will develop its domestic plan of actions and the target on the amount of emission reduction that they are ready to commit to. And in 5 years, in 2020, when the Paris Agreement will be entering into force, countries will meet again, will review their plans, will see if these plans actually allow to achieve 1.5 degrees goal, and will decide if they believe in this goal at all. 2020 turned into 2021 due to events we all know about, and COP26 has become this long-awaited moment. Things became even more spicy considering the results that came from the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Some of the first published insights state that temperatures have been rising even faster than in previous IPCC assessment cycles. Global mean surface temperature has increased by almost 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels already. And scientists are highly confident that concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere are higher than they have been for at least the past 2 million years. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the report a code red for humanity. He also stated that there is no time for delay and no room for excuses, and that he counts on government leaders and all stakeholders to ensure COP26 is a success. When I read for the first time about all the discussions and decisions that took place at the conference, I realized that I need some kind of a framework to make this video, to structure the discussions in some way, and I decided to use the following logic. Climate change-related actions can be divided into 3 main categories. Mitigation, all actions related to limiting greenhouse gas emissions and preventing climate change. Adaptation, helping people, economies, and the environment adapt and prepare for the impacts of climate change. And loss and damage, which is literally loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. And there is one cross-cutting category, finance. Most discussions at the conference were about mitigation, and one of the key of them is about goals. Overall temperature goal that we are trying to achieve, and domestic targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, called NDC, Nationally Determined Contributions. And there is good news and bad news on that front. The good news is the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is the result of the conference basically, reaffirms the initial goal of the Paris Agreement to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's good. The bad news is countries are not sure how to achieve it. Still, even now, after the 5 years of developing all the possible plans, there is no plan of action that would lead to this goal. Domestic targets of countries collectively lead to much severe climate change than 1.5 degrees. When countries signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, they did agree with the overarching goal to limit global temperature rise to well below 2, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, basically proving that world governments and their leaders have finally heard the scientific community and agreed with them. But the Paris Agreement is purposefully designed in a way that it has both top-down and bottom-up goals. Top-down is the one about 1.5 degrees. All parties who ratified the agreement agreed with this goal. The second part is bottom-up goals. Each country decides for itself how much emissions reductions they are ready to commit to, and reflects it in the document called Nationally Determined Contributions, NDC. Every 5 years occurs the process called mandatory NDC cycle. When countries prepare their NDCs, submit them, then these documents get reviewed to see if combined effort of all the countries lead to the top-down temperature goal. The first time NDCs were prepared and then reviewed was in 2016 when the Paris Agreement got ratified. Back then, combined effort of all NDCs would lead to limiting global warming not to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but to 3.3 degrees, which is quite a lot. So countries got the task to come back in 5 years with an updated and strengthened NDCs to see if now, with its increased ambitions, they actually gonna meet the 1.5 goal. And the next review happened at COP26. The results show that countries' commitments are still nowhere near the path towards 1.5 degrees. If the world will continue to act based on current policies, then by the end of the century we're gonna have global temperature rise by 2.7 degrees Celsius. In case the world will be able to implement all of the 2030 NDC targets, then the global temperature rise is still high, 2.4 degrees. In less probable case, if we will implement not only NDC targets, but also long-term targets, global temperature rise is still high, 2.1 degrees. And in the best case scenario, in case of a full implementation of all announced targets, we still have global mean temperature rise higher than the Paris Agreement goal, 1.8 degrees Celsius. I mean, it is certainly better than the 4 degrees Celsius trajectory that the world was on before the Paris Agreement, but it is still extremely dangerous. There is also some good news here. After quite a heated discussion, countries agreed not to wait next 5 years to review the goals again, but to do it in a year. So the next year at COP27, there will be another review. Hopefully countries will increase their ambitions, and hopefully this review will show that we are on the right trajectory towards 1.5 degrees. So, summing up the results of the negotiations in this section, I believe it's fair to use the quote of Alok Sharma, president for COP26. He states that it's true that COP26 have kept 1.5 goal alive, but its pulse is weak and it will only survive if the promises will be kept and translated into rapid action. After almost 6 years of negotiations and disagreements, a number of important implementation-related aspects were finalized. The first one, and one of the most contentious issues, was international cooperation under the Paris Agreement. Up to 2020, the international cooperation on climate change was basically defined by the Kyoto Protocol. But then Kyoto Protocol got expired and the Paris Agreement had to enter into force, so the mechanisms of international cooperation also had to be reviewed and updated. Kyoto market mechanisms were far from being perfect, and I talked about this in my previous video. So now countries, among other things, wanted to implement some lessons learned to make new market mechanisms better based on what they know worked well and worked not that well. So the first issue discussed in this area is double counting or double claiming. Double counting is basically a situation where 2 or more countries can claim the same emission reduction towards achieving overall mitigation target. Logically, it was quite obvious double counting is wrong. And I mean, it goes against any accounting rules. But nevertheless, there was strong opposition from Brazil and several supporting countries like India or Russia, and the most obvious reason for that is that these countries generated a huge portion of carbon offsets under the Clean Development Mechanism, one of Kyoto Protocol's mechanisms, and they plan to continue doing so, so most likely they just wanted to avoid additional mitigation effort and count those carbon offsets towards achieving their NDCs, even though they sold those offsets to other countries. I mean, mathematically this is totally wrong, but there were lots of negotiations about this, and luckily double counting is not allowed under the Paris Agreement. Second major question was what to do with carbon offsets generated but not sold under the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto compliance markets have generated hundreds of millions of carbon credits from more than 8,000 projects. Some of these projects have already started selling their carbon credits, some of them did not, but they may request to issue carbon credits for all the years that project has been operating. And if this happens, there will be over 4 billion carbon credits available, and that's a lot. If all of these credits enter the market under the Paris Agreement, it might be a problem because, first of all, most of them are of poor quality, as standards back then were still raw. It means they really do not help much to limit the global temperature rise. Secondly, full carryover of Kyoto credits could oversupply the market under the Paris Agreement and drop prices, lowering motivation for the low-carbon transition. And thirdly, all of them have already occurred in the past, so it will limit new actions. Countries may lower their already weak emission reduction targets and achieve them without any additional effort just by purchasing these old and low-quality carbon credits. And for the climate, it's no good. But I mean, I kinda also understand the arguments of the countries who issued these carbon credits because they invested in projects to create carbon credits and they expected to cover the cost by selling these carbon credits. And in the end, they might just lose an opportunity to compensate for their investments. Well, in the end, the countries agreed to a carryover of the Kyoto's carbon credits. But not all of them, luckily. Only the ones issued in the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which is from 2013 to 2020. Thus, it's not 4 billions, but somewhat around 100 to 300 millions of them, according to different estimates. So again, it's not a binary situation, it depends on how you look at it. On the one hand, it's a good thing that not all of the old carbon credits will enter the markets under the Paris Agreement. But for the climate, it's a loss that any amount will. Share of proceeds is a commission on trading of carbon credits that goes to the Adaptation Fund for developing countries. This means carbon markets would generate an additional source of finance for developing nations to fund their efforts to prepare for climate change. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there was such a mechanism. Back then, 2% of the value of carbon credits issued for CDM projects went to the Adaptation Fund. Under the Paris Agreement, there are two market mechanisms. The first one, described in the Article 6.2, is bilateral cooperation mechanism for trading of internationally traded mitigation outcomes between governments only. The second one, described in the Article 6.4, is multilateral cooperation mechanism that allows trading of emissions reduction for countries and the private sector anywhere in the world. So this is the new international carbon market and basically the replacement of CDM. Initially, there was a point of view that the share of proceeds had to be applied to both of those mechanisms, but this idea didn't get the necessary support, and in the end, to reach an agreement, countries had to compromise and decide that the share of proceeds will be applied only to the markets under the Article 6.4. So it was decided that 5% of the value of credits issued under the Article 6.4 mechanism will go to the Adaptation Fund. Common timeframe of NDCs. NDCs that countries developed so far have different end dates. Some countries, such as US and Brazil, cover the period through 2025, while others, for example, European Union, China, India, run through 2030. Timeframes used in NDCs are important because, among other things, they affect how often countries will be able to review the results, meaning how often they will be able to strengthen the next ambition in case the results fall short of the target. The best option for climate would be for NDCs to advance in successive 5-year intervals, and luckily this is the option countries agreed upon at the conference. Transparency rules define how countries report on the progress of their NDC implementation. And they are quite important because you cannot manage something that you cannot measure or that you cannot track results of properly. Additionally, since under the Paris Agreement, countries do not have legal obligations to actually achieve climate goal, the peer review and public pressure are basically the only drivers to make countries act. Well, of course, apart from the own will of the countries. And transparent reporting actually allows peers and public and everyone interested to understand what's going on and apply pressure when it's needed. Pete Betts highlighted this idea, saying that there are no penalties in the climate regime, there is only naming and shaming, so having a functioning transparency regime is absolutely key to the whole system working. At COP26, countries finally agreed on transparency rules, and they surely have to make reporting more understandable, more consistent, which is good. So, all in all, I think this is a good thing that countries achieved compromises on the operational questions, on the implementation rules, because even though they're not perfect, But nevertheless, at least now countries can start, act and implement the Paris Agreement and not wait for further negotiations and discussions that would just postpone climate action even more. Apart from these major discussions that had to happen to agree on the further implementation of the Paris Agreement, countries also made several additional announcements, quite important ones. The first one we're going to talk about is coal. For the first time in the history of almost 30 years of climate summits, countries explicitly mentioned phasing out of fossil fuels, in particular coal, in the final agreement. In most of articles I read, this event is regarded as a huge success. And partially I agree. I mean, coal supplies about a third of global electricity generation, so I can imagine how hard it is to negotiate phasing it out, especially considering all the pressure from lobbyists. Previously, major oil and gas and coal-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia and Russia always managed to keep any references to fossil fuels out of the final text of the COP agreement. At COP26, they also tried it. According to an analysis from Global Witness, fossil fuel industry had the largest delegation of over 500 lobbyists from more than 100 fossil fuel companies in Glasgow, which is larger than the combined total of the 8 delegations from the countries worst affected by climate change in the last 2 decades. So the fact that coal and fossil fuel subsidies were even mentioned in the final agreement, I mean, that's already a victory. But unfortunately, the final text was watered down quite significantly. The first draft had the strongest wording. It called on countries to accelerate the phasing out of coal and subsidies for fossil fuels. Then the draft has changed. Now countries should accelerate the phase out of unabated coal power and of inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. Then, in the very last moment, the wording was changed again, and it was weakened significantly by changing phasing out to phasing down. But I agree with Jennifer Morgan, Executive Director of Greenpeace International. At least now there is a clear signal that the era of coal is ending. According to the World Resources Institute, if tropical deforestation were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide on Earth. At COP26, additional attention was brought to forests and its essential meaning to limit climate change and loss of biodiversity. 141 countries signed the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use, promising to collectively halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030, while delivering sustainable development and promoting an inclusive rural transformation. And these countries represent 90% of globe's forested land. So far so good, right? I mean, sounds good, really. But there is a couple of concerns on the table. First of all, countries did not mention how exactly they're gonna achieve this goal. If country doesn't have a plan, then how they can be sure that the goal is actually achievable? Secondly, similar pledges already existed and failed. Basically, same countries also signed the 2014 New York Declaration on Forests, which pledged to halve deforestation by 2020 and end it completely by 2030. And unfortunately, according to Global Forest Watch data, global deforestation has increased between 55 and 64% since the declaration was signed, meaning that the pledge has basically failed. And third, according to the United Nations definition of deforestation, plantations are also counted as forests. Plantations to produce palm oil, paper, or wood pellets burned to make energy. They lack biodiversity and are less efficient at storing carbon. But technically, converting indigenous forests into plantation is not forbidden under the declaration. So instead of investing in indigenous forests protection, finances that back the declaration can be used to create new plantations. So again, the declaration sounds like a good idea, something that we need to do, but it has certain loopholes that might undermine the whole idea, the whole point. Over 100 countries signed the Global Methane Pledge. The pledge asks countries to reduce their methane emissions by 30% in the current decade. So it could reduce global warming by 0.2 degrees Celsius by 2050. Countries that sign the pledge represent nearly half of global methane emissions and about 70% of global GDP. But unfortunately, the top 3 emitters of the methane, India, China and Russia, did not sign the pledge yet, so it's not clear if it's going to be actually feasible to achieve the results without them. COP26 presidency team also announced a new declaration on accelerating the transition to 100% zero-emission cars and vans. About 40 countries signed the declaration, including UK, Norway, Chile and Canada, but other major economies such as US and China opted out. Professor David Bailey stated that without the US, China and Germany on board, we are not going to get vehicle emissions where we need to be by 2050. Similar situation with automotive manufacturers. Several major players, such as Volvo, Daimler, Ford and General Motors, joined the declaration, but other major car makers, such as Volkswagen, Renault, Stellantis, BMW and Nissan, didn't. They still might join later, but as of now, it's quite questionable if the declaration will be able to achieve required emissions reduction in transportation. Climate finance follows the principle of climate justice. It arises from the idea that developed nations bear the greatest responsibility for climate change, but poor developing nations are the ones suffering the most from its consequences. Additionally, without financing, developing nations might not be able to achieve any significant reduction of their greenhouse gas emissions, which puts the achievement of 1.5 temperature goal under risk. Back in 2009, wealthy nations pledged to provide $100 billion annually by 2020 to help vulnerable nations to cut their emissions and prepare themselves for the effects of climate change. And needless to say that this didn't happen. The maximum amount of climate finance was achieved in 2019. It equals to almost $80 billion. But unfortunately, up to now, it never reached the necessary goal of $100 billion. And $100 billion is not that much actually. According to International Monetary Fund, in 2020 fossil fuel subsidies reached almost $6 trillion. US only spent on military purposes in 2020 almost $800 billion. So it's not like the developed world doesn't have money, it's just an illustration that climate finance is still a low priority. As a result of negotiations, developing nations were promised that the goal of $100 billion will be achieved, but by 2023. Additionally, countries agreed to double funding for adaptation by 2025, which would amount in approximately $40 billion. As of now, most of climate financing goes to mitigation projects in energy systems and transportation, and only a quarter of climate finance went to adaptation in 2019. But the necessity for adaptation measures is growing every year. So the reshuffle of financing seems to be the right thing to do. Besides discussing financials, there was some progress made on the global goal on adaptation. Article 7 of the Paris Agreement sets out that the global goal on adaptation has to be established. Something similar on mitigation goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, so that everyone would understand the numeric target of adaptation efforts and can build a plan to achieve it and build a proper reporting system to track the results. But it's not as obvious as in the case of mitigation measures. All countries will need to adapt, but exact actions and the scale of effort will be different, depending on a variety of factors such as economic conditions, GDP structure, geographical location, etc. So lots of questions have to be answered to establish this mutual goal. However, there has been little progress so far. Adaptation still doesn't get the required amount of political attention. But at COP26, the parties adopted the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program. In practice, it means that through the series of meetings and workshops with governments and scientists, the working group will try to come up with some ideas for metrics that could be the measure of adaptation effort. And these metrics then will be reviewed at COP27. This is a step towards making adaptation a priority in the same way that mitigation is, which is really crucial for vulnerable nations. Historically, the question of loss and damage was not that actively discussed, but just as in case of adaptation, its importance is growing over time. Destructions caused by extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and other consequences of climate change already hit many vulnerable nations, causing severe and sometimes irreversible damage. Island nations, such as Tuvalu and Marshall Islands, are already suffering land loss due to rising sea levels and land degradation, causing people to leave their homes and become climate refugees. As of now, there is no mechanism under the Paris Agreement for loss and damage funding. As the first step to resolve this issue, a Santiago Network on Loss and Damage was established at COP25 in Madrid. The role of the network was defined as the following: to catalyze and channel reliable technical assistance to support efforts and approaches to address loss and damage. In practice, Santiago Network has become a website with a list of organizations that developing nations can try to reach out to in case they need money for loss and damage purposes, and nothing more. At COP26, developing nations came up with a quite reasonable idea. Let's give to Santiago Network staff, funding, responsibilities it needs, to convert it into a network that really helps to get an access to finance and that not just gives list of links. Developed countries did not really support this idea. They also did not support the idea to fund loss and damage separately, to create kind of a third stream of funding besides mitigation and adaptation. So as a result, there was basically no compromise and the discussion was moved to COP27. So guys, all in all, we've covered all the main decisions and main discussions that happened at COP26. And when I was thinking like, okay, what I personally think about the results, I honestly have quite a mixed opinion. I mean, there is certainly a progress in the right direction. Yeah, 100%. But somehow I cannot get rid of the feeling that, it's been almost 30 years of climate summits. And we still measure the success of the summit by the amount of promises we get, not by the real results and actions that happened already. I don't know, this is really weird. Or maybe it's just me, I don't know, honestly. But to summarize the whole summit, I chose several quotes that I believe reflect the best what happened there. Mary Robinson agrees that COP26 has made some progress, but she also highlights that it's still not enough to avoid climate disaster and that not enough leaders came to Glasgow with a crisis mindset. Manuel Pulgar Vidal also says that we must acknowledge that progress was made. He also urges to start the implementation and says that countries have to sharply pivot to implementation and show substantial results. Prince Charles sends the similar message. He says that we must now translate fine words into still finer actions. Guys, thank you so much for watching and for being interested in this important topic. And I wanted to thank you all for your comments and your feedback. I'm eager to keep developing my channel and post more often, and your comments really give me such a boost of motivation that I cannot even describe, honestly. So thank you so much, guys, and see you in the next video.